I know what you're thinking, that this morning's session was destructive. You are thinking that it's great fun to destroy and to pour mockery upon views of which one disapproves. You may think that I am as guilty here as Monsignor Ronald Knox was in the satires that he wrote in his withering, satirical destruction of the sort of higher biblical criticism which was fashionable in his day and which actually still is the dominant school in biblical criticism. You are quite right. It is easy, and it can be fun, to be destructive and to attack through mockery. I do hope, however, to prove this evening that I am capable, on rare occasions, of getting to something which is positive and constructive rather than destructive. I, however, make no real apologies for what I've done, in as far as it seems to me that the disaster and the crisis in biblical studies over the last 200 years is something which it is important to clear out of the way. The risk in clearing something erroneous out of the way is that it's positively boring to those who've never heard of the mistake in the first place. Because first of all, they've got to learn what the mistake was, and then they've got to learn why the mistake was a mistake. And it would be natural for them to feel, perhaps, that it might have been simpler not to mention the mistake at all, whether to affirm it or to destroy it, but to get on to the positive. However, I do think that there is a danger that well-meaning people can look at books in libraries or on bookshop shelves and can think that, well, people have a natural instinct to think that the printed word is right. When I used to teach, sometimes one of the less able students would come up to me and say, "I think what you said yesterday, Father, must be wrong, because I found something in a book here which disagrees with it." And one tried to explain that what's in a printed book doesn't necessarily have to be right, or quite the opposite is true, perhaps nowadays more than in any other age. But there is an instinct on the part of many people to feel that a thing that is in print perhaps has some sort of standard authority dangling around its neck. That's why I think it is important to know what's wrong, and why the Church, indeed, throughout her history, has been very happy to sprinkle anathemas around. From Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea onwards, the Church has condemned errors. Once an error arises, it can be very difficult to uproot. I will finish off now a section which I started this morning, basically on what's wrong with old-style, higher criticism of the sort that Monsignor Ronnie Knox was so vividly crucifying. And I'd better come clean here. I have a subtext. The subtext is that I am a priest of a weird organization called the Ordinariate, which means that while we are full Catholics, we believe it all. In fact, we like to think, in our arrogant Anglican English way, that we believe rather more of it than some people who are what's known as cradle Catholics. One of the jobs that Pope Benedict gave us, I feel inclined to call him Blessed Pope Benedict, but since he's still alive, that's blessed with a small b. Perhaps it'll be blessed with a large B before all of you here have passed your rewards. When Blessed Benedict XVI erected the ordinariates, 3 of them, one in America, one in England, one in Australia, one of the main purposes was that they should bring into the Catholic Church the riches of the Anglican tradition, which they had as part of their baggage. I don't know whether any of you ever read when you were tiny the Swiss Family Robinson book, in which a Swiss family Robinson is shipwrecked near a desert island, and it is important to get from the wreck, isn't it, everything on the wreck that might be useful in their life on this desert island. And so it's constant voyages back to the wreck to bring valuable and useful things to their new, safe abode. I like to think of the ordinariate as performing that role. And in fact, the Monsignor Ronnie Knox that I was thrusting down your throats this morning wrote the things that he wrote, which I read out to you, when he was an Anglican. So there was a bit of, if you like, Anglicanism that you were getting, whether you liked it or not. I'm afraid I move on to 3 more Anglicans before I start being positive. The first is a man whom I think many of you may well have heard of, called C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis. Not an Englishman. He is an Ulsterman, or was an Ulsterman by birth, but very much a part of English literary, philosophical culture. He started off life as an atheist. Many of the best people do. He was an atheist, and quite a vigorously and convinced atheist. He then became a Christian, not because he wanted to, but because it seemed to him, as he put it, that a door slammed behind him. All sorts of intellectual processes and intellectual arguments that he had been pursuing led him to one place, which was Christianity. It's like having a door shut behind you and you're inside and you can't help it, he said. He was not somebody for whom Christianity was, at least at the conscious level, wish fulfillment, but somebody who didn't want it, hadn't believed in it, but saw its truth from the logic of the argument. He wrote a number of things, and for anybody who wants to do their own do-it-yourself spiritual direction, I still think that his book, The Screwtape Letters. Screwtape is a devil who tempts others into sin, or rather, he's a high-up devil, and it's his nephew who does the tempting. And these are letters from a senior devil to a junior devil on how to tempt. And reading these letters gives one, I keep returning to them as the decades roll on, gives you an insight into the way in which, with your own help, the devil has managed to get at you and to corrupt your best intentions. As I say, it's quite light reading. It's not heavy and theological with lots of footnotes. It's easy reading, but it's terribly profound. He also wrote Mere Christianity. He never became a Catholic, but in nothing that he wrote did he ever deal with matters in which the Catholic Church and the Church of England were not united. He wrote a book called Mere Christianity, which is still, I think, one of the best simple introductions to basic mere Christianity. And I say that with a view to Catholic readers as well as with a view to Anglican readers. But he wrote a great deal more. He started off his academic life as a classicist, in other words, Latin, you name it, Greek, you name it, he knew it all. He then became a teacher of Renaissance and medieval literature, particularly English Renaissance and medieval literature, and one of the great intellectual figures of our age. One day, in 1956, he was visiting an Anglican seminary in Cambridge called Westcott House. And while he was having a glass of sherry with the principal was called away on business, as principals so often are for a few minutes, and as one does in these circumstances, C.S. Lewis looked at a new theological book which was on the principal's table. And when he came back, to cut a long story short, he told the principal what absolute bilge it all was. It was a book about the Bible, what absolute bilge it all was, and proceeded to give him a number of very deft explanations of why it was bilge. The principal said, "I think it might be a good idea if you came back sometime and delivered a paper on your ideas to my young men." And so he did, and it was subsequently published as Fern Seed and Elephants. And it's just like that thing of Ronnie Knox's. It's a great destruction of the dominant school of 20th century New Testament scholarship. There are some really funny bits in that paper where he is, as Knox was, cruelly funny at the expense of those that he's putting down. But perhaps you've had enough of people being cruelly funny about baddies from me today already. So I'll read one of the more positive things in Fern Seed and Elephants. He's dealing, of course, with those New Testament scholars who think that there's nothing true in the New Testament at all, that it's all, this is what he says. Turn to John. Read the dialogues. That with the Samaritan woman at the well, or that which follows the healing of the man born blind. Look at its pictures. Jesus, if I may use the word, he puts that parenthesis in, Jesus, if I may use the word, as I'm afraid, Jesus, if I may use the word, doodling with his finger in the dust, the unforgettable, and it was night, when Judas Iscariot went out from the Last Supper. I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, in other words, it's somebody writing down what actually happened. An anathema to the higher critics, the 20th century biblical critics. They would have the heebie-jeebies at the thought that what was in the gospel narratives was something that actually happened or was actually spoken. Either this is a reportage, pretty close up to the facts, or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. The sort of novels that we read nowadays, the sort of novels that we've read since Jane Austen and Anthony Trollope. If it is untrue, it must be narrative of that kind, like a Dickens novel or a modern novel. The reader who doesn't see this has simply not learnt to read. I would recommend him to read Auerbach, who was a bloke who wrote about the representation of reality in Western literature. The higher critics claimed that the Gospels were some sort of confected fiction and likened them to romances. For example, the romance of King Arthur. We'd read about King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. I remember reading Enid Blyton's version of the story when I was a tiny boy, and rather wondering what it was that Guinevere had done. It was never really quite explained in the children's book, whatever it was that Guinevere had done, so that she had to be so mysteriously burnt. Merlin, the witch, Morgana le Fay, the Knights of the Round Table. It's a romance. We read it. People have read it for centuries. People have enjoyed it for centuries, but nobody supposes that it's anything other than a romance. That's a romance. Lewis is saying that he spent his whole academic life reading that sort of stuff, and he knows that the Gospels are not that. The higher critics may think the Gospels are like the Arthurian legends, but they are not. And he went on to say that he quoted various German scholars, of course, like Bultmann, phrases like, "Through what strange process has this learned German gone in order to make himself believe this?" and so on. And in the end he says how incredible it is that people can believe some of the things they believe on such slender evidence. And he says it's like people who claim to be able to discern fern seed, which is a microscopic substance, isn't it, fern seed, who claim to be able to discern fern seed when they can't see an elephant at 10 paces. Things are so obvious, the things that the higher critics don't notice. The second person that I come on to, I wouldn't expect many of you to have heard of. C.S. Lewis, he is still really quite a name to conjure with, and his books are still in print. The next one is quite a different person, E.L. Maskell, Eric Maskell, another Anglican. He started life as a mathematician, doing the Cambridge mathematical tripos. He has in common with C.S. Lewis, however, the fact that neither of them was part of the New Testament industry. Neither of them was part of that gang of scholars all backing each other up who'd gone for this so-called higher criticism and had established their own orthodoxy, which everybody was expected to go along with. And indeed the third of the three I'm dealing with is the same. She also, for she is a woman, she also was never part of the New Testament scholarship game. E.L. Maskell started life as a mathematician. He then became a dogmatic theologian. In other words, he had never really taken an interest in the questions, like the synoptic problem. Like the synoptic problem and the Bible that belonged to the girl who had coloured every word in 3 different colours. Maskell, therefore, comes to the Gospels as you or I might, in a sense, as a Christian outsider, not as somebody who has a stake in the academic game of writing books about the synoptic problem or whatever. Here's something that he wrote. And again, what he's impressed by is the obvious sincerity and truth of the narrative that is put before us. It is perfectly possible and very edifying to read the story as a highly symbolic expression of the themes of Jesus as the light of the world. This is the story of the healing of the blind beggar in St. John's Gospel. It's easy to read it as a symbolic expression of Jesus as the light of the world, conversion to Christianity as illumination, the supersession of Judaism by Christianity, and so on, and to conclude that the factual basis of the narrative is at once some one or other rumoured healings of blind men by Jesus, which the evangelist has worked up into a detailed and highly circumstantial account. However, when one reads the chapter in a perfectly straightforward way, one can hardly avoid being struck by the vivid impression of eyewitness reporting. I don't think he'd read C.S. Lewis's paper, but he comes to the same point. You have that conviction that this must be eyewitness reporting. and by the extremely convincing characterization of the persons involved. The blind beggar has all the features of the underprivileged and physically handicapped man, whose wits have been sharpened in the struggle for existence, who is easily frightened and yet quick to express his loyalty to the stranger who has done so much for him. And the reality of the dialogue which then follows, Maskell emphasizes by translating it into a modern English dialect known as Cockney. Whether you be a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Yesterday I couldn't see a ruddy thing, and I can see all right. O-R-L, all right. Laugh that one off. Secondly, where the text is, I have told you already, and ye did not hear, therefore would ye hear again. Will ye also be his disciples? I have told you once, ain't I? Do you want me to tell you again? I suppose you're thinking about becoming his disciples now, are you? Thirdly, why? Herein is a marvellous thing, that ye know not from whence he is. Yet he opened mine eyes. Now, if we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man, now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Well, this is a round go, ain't it? It says in the Bible, don't it, that God don't take no notice of sinners? And if a bloke says his prayers and tries to keep straight, God will listen to him, won't he? Those among you whose profession is to read theology, you might find E.L. Maskell's books, Maskell with 2 L's, really very illuminating with regard to things like sacramental teaching. He wrote a book called Corpus Christi, and with regard to ecclesiology, and particularly with regard to his destructive books about modern errors. A vivid impression of eyewitness reporting was his conclusion. The third person, again an Anglican, that I wish to introduce you to, is Dorothy Lee Sayers, who some of you may have heard of as a novelist who wrote Peter Wimsey detective stories. Well, a girl has to do something to earn her living, doesn't she? And she did that, and she did it very well, and she made a lot of money out of it. And I think that, if you like an odd detective story, Agatha Christie is plain dumb wooden all the way through. There is a capital M murderer, and there is a detective, and there is the red herring, and so on. Dorothy Sayers' detective fiction is much more sophisticated. It actually does have characterization in it. But that's not what we're looking at her for today. She started studying Latin. None of these people I'm talking about was a slouch. She started doing Latin at the age of 6, as one does, or as perhaps one did in those days. She got a first-class degree at Oxford before women were allowed to have degrees at Oxford. They were allowed to do the examination. They were told which class of the class list they were in, but they weren't actually, at those days, allowed to actually take the degree, have the degree, call themselves BA. She got a first in medieval literature in Italian, and she did a brilliant translation of Dante. She amused herself. She was not one of these people who always lived a closeted life. She ended up with an illegitimate son. Then she became a Christian. And she wrote some plays about the last days of Jesus, which were a cause célèbre at the time. Because just as, curious, isn't it? Just as Maskell made his point by translating what the blind beggar said into the English dialect called Cockney, so Sayers translated, as it were, the narratives of the last days of Jesus, the man born to be king. She translated it into language that didn't seem like Bible language. You must remember that this was a time when Bible, for English people, meant something like the King James Bible. These and thous and arts and words and things all over the place as far as the eye can see. She wrote it into accessible English that made it seem like real events really happening, rather than like artificial events happening in a world that spoke an artificial language. In the introduction to A Man Born to be King, she wrote this. It's interesting that, again, she is turning to, like the other two, she turns to St. John's Gospel for her examples. It must be remembered that of the four Evangelicals, St. John's is the only one that claims to be the direct report of an eyewitness. And to anyone accustomed to the imaginative handling of documents, it's so similar to C.S. Lewis's point, isn't it? He said, I've been handling documents all my life and I can tell you this and that. She'd been handling documents too, right? Dante. To anyone accustomed to the imaginative handling of documents, the internal evidence bears out this claim. The synoptists, on the whole, report the set pieces. It is St. John who reports the words and actions of the individual, unrepeated occasion, retrieving them from that storehouse of trained memory, which among people not made forgetful by too much pen and ink, replaces the filed records and the stenographer's notebook. It is, generally speaking, John who knows the time of year, the time of day, where people sat, and how they got from one place to another. It's John who remembers not only what Jesus said, but what the other people said to him, who can reproduce the cut and thrust of controversy and the development of an argument. It is John who faithfully reproduces the emphasis and repetition of a teacher trying to get a new idea across to a rather unintelligent and inattentive audience. It is he again who has caught the characteristic tricks of manner and delivery, the curious outflanking movement of the dialectic, capturing outpost after outpost by apparently irrelevant questions, and then suddenly pouncing upon the main position from the rear. And the Amen, Amen, Lego Humid, indeed and indeed I tell you, which ushers in the most important statements. By and large, the higher critics were not men who had cut their teeth on literature. These Anglican scholars who had cut their teeth on literature, they have a remarkably similar story to tell. And these were people who discovered orthodoxy. They were not brought up as cradle Catholics or as cradle Anglicans. These were people who discovered orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy, for themselves out of their own personal intellectual quest. And as I said a moment ago, I really would like to feel that it was part of my job as an ordinary priest to bring these people into the fullness of Catholicity, that their witness to the truths which they discerned and eloquently put across can be a possession for the whole Catholic Church, as Blessed Benedict XVI wished. The present state of things, by present I mean from about 1990 to about 2010, is, well, I think it's summed up for me by a man called Nineham, who taught at Oxford and was the head of an Oxford college, and indeed wrote a book, a commentary on St. Mark's Gospel, which I urge you not to read. The honest reason why I would urge you not to read it is that it is wholly mistaken. The other, more personal and engaged reason is that it is absolutely and completely boring. It's not just wrong and funny, it's wrong and boring. Nineham, when dealing with undergraduate students who had come to Oxford intending to study the Bible, to read theology, which at Oxford still is largely a matter of, basically a matter of studying the Christian scriptures, although you can, like everywhere, they provide alternatives nowadays if you don't want to do that. Basically, it's still biblical. What you've got to do with young men who come to Oxford to read New Testament studies, he said, you have to, first of all, you have to destroy their faith. Because not until you've destroyed their faith can you actually start to get them thinking along the right lines about the documents which are going to be studied. Don't you think that's teensy-weensy bit on the chilling side, that somebody in that position, working in a college which was founded, in fact, to promote the Christian faith, should believe that you've got to destroy people's faith, the simple trusting faith they've come up with, not in order to make it more sophisticated, but so that you can fill their heads with higher criticism. I think he is a symbolic figure. He's not long dead. I think he's a fairly symbolic figure of the point New Testament studies reached in academe. Another, and I'm going to read a bit from another bloke. This is a man called Leslie Holden, another Oxford person, and you must forgive the Oxford bias. When I was an undergraduate, he was an old-style Tridentine Anglo-Catholic. I mean, if anybody had a high mass going and they needed a subdeacon all of a sudden, and then he joined in. He was the sort of priest who was always dressed very neatly in black and performed all his duties and all that sort of thing. He then somehow, more or less overnight, seemed to lose his faith. Perhaps he had tea with Professor Nineham. Anyway, he later on wrote a paper on, well, he calls it Enlightenment, Establishment and the Word. He wrote a paper. I think he delivered it to a society to begin with, about where New Testament studies had got to. And what he's saying, in effect, is people don't know what they're getting. People, especially if they think they want to be clergy, they think the Bible is important. Therefore, they've got to read the Bible. Therefore, they've got to study the Bible. Therefore, the more they know about the Bible, the better. Therefore, the more, better and bigger books about the Bible which they can get their minds around, the better, and so on. And then, as they pursue this desire of understanding, reading about, getting themselves around the Bible, they suddenly realize that what they're getting themselves around is absolutely no use to them whatsoever. It has to be admitted that among its most natural clientele, clergy and others professionally involved with the Bible, modern biblical criticism has never received more than a patchy welcome or more than a half-hearted embrace. For generation after generation of students of theology, there has been, as far as very many of them are concerned, a sad sequence. First, a recognition of the Bible's key place in theology, desire therefore to study it, then initiation into the tools and substance of study as currently perceived. Next, a recognition of alarming complexity and growing distance between the subject as enjoined and such theological matters as claimed your attention. An increasing series of realizations to the effect that the Bible will not, after all, serve this or that hoped-for purpose. Finally, an abandonment of biblical studies as having no useful service to perform, no balm to give. I disagree with Holden's beliefs, but that, I think, is absolutely bang-on account of where biblical criticism had got to when he wrote into the year 2000. People started doing it because they wanted to be priests, they wanted to make their teaching better, they wanted to make their preaching better, they wanted to make their pastoral work better by appropriating the scriptures. And what better could a young man going into the priesthood wish to do than that? Then they realized, when they read by higher critics, that what they were reading was simply not going to deliver the help and the formation which they had expected. So they gave it up. Imagine an ordinary who, like the young lady I've But suppose you spend weeks and months doing that sort of thing, you then realize, what exactly, how exactly is this going to help me to write a sermon for next Sunday morning? And so they gave up spiritual study. Another point that Holden makes is one of the reasons why this sort of attitude to Scripture took hold upon universities, such as the University, I'm ashamed to say, of Oxford. And it's because people, academics studying the New Testament or the Old Testament, people studying the Bible, people in an academic ambiance studying the Bible, felt very nervous. I don't quite know how to put this. Felt very nervous at being alongside people who were doing, let us say, astrophysics or medieval history or philosophy or biology or whatever, because there was a sort of sense that if you're studying astrophysics, then all you want is the truth. You haven't got some personal agenda. I feel much better if Mars has a mean temperature of 32 degrees. There's no sort of personal involvement in it. Whereas they felt, these biblical scholars, that people suspected them of having a personal involvement. Those people ever look at them, many of them have got clerical collars. They don't wear them much of the time, but they've got a clerical collar somewhere, these chaps. I mean, what they're doing is not honest academic work, because they're not just like any other academic following the truth wherever it leads. They're sort of aggrandized Sunday school teachers who are just hoping to persuade themselves and others that what they're saying is the truth. So they tried, as it were, to anaesthetize themselves so that they were not perceived as being just rather superior Sunday school teachers flogging some dreary old religion which is only fit for old women and children. Leslie Holden, puts it like this: whether you admire it or despise it, because I think it is undeniable that British New Testament studies has been virtually beyond reproach in its adherence to the accepted canons of non-ideological scholarship. In other words, non-ideological scholarship, not plugging a line, but just trying to get truth. He goes on, go to any gathering of British New Testament scholars, and you will be hard put to it, not only to distinguish denominational loyalties, but also to tell Christian believers from non-believers. The way these people talk, these New Testament scholars, you can't even tell whether they believe a word of it or not. They're so determined to sound like impartial people, just like biologists or whatever, looking at the evidence and simply going where the evidence leads. Not even really quite sure between ourselves whether even scientific studies are really quite as honest as that. And I think in any academic field, this has been my experience. A scholar, academic, gets some hunch, and then he spends a lot of time trying to make the evidence fit that hunch that he's got, so that he can write a really world-shattering book about it. But that's to digress. But what you say, what you want to ask me, is what about Catholics? Were Catholics as bad as the rest? The problem about Catholicism was that at the beginning of the 20th century there was a movement called modernism, of which you may have heard. Modernism was very bad, and St. Pius X was very good in order when he put down modernism by condemning it. One of the things that was happening at the time was a load of sort of rubbish that I've been sharing with you about biblical studies, And Pius X founded a thing called the Biblical Commission, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which issued quite a lot of condemnations of errors in biblical studies. And quite right too. But this, you see, had the effect of making people believe, non-Catholics believed, that you can't really take a Catholic writer seriously because poor bloke, he's just saying what his church says he has to say, if you see what I mean. Therefore, although the Catholic Church did have that input at the beginning of the 20th century, it inevitably had that sort of effect of meaning that Catholic scholars, if they did write something, were not taken very seriously. By the middle of the 20th century, Rome was no longer quite as fierce about that sort of thing. Under Pius XII, there are Catholics who think that everything problematic in the modern church came from something called the Second Vatican Council. Actually, there were a lot of things that were wrong before it, in the pontificate of Pius XII, and it's certainly arguable that if the Second Vatican Council had never happened, then it might have been even worse in the Catholic Church than it was. There were things already going wrong. There was a German biblical scholar called Cardinal Bayer who had very much the ear of Pius XII, and he was not what I would call a sound man. And when Pius XII wrote an encyclical on Scripture called Divino Afflante Spiritu, it doesn't contain anything in it that gives me any problems. I can't put my finger on anything in it and say, I can't believe that. I mean, here it is in a papal magisterial document, but I really find that very, very hard to swallow. No, there's nothing like that. What I do find is, however, that it doesn't say the things that I think it ought to say. And in 1993, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which still exists, but only it doesn't have any authority nowadays, it just discusses and produces reports for people to read if they're interested. It doesn't have the right to tell people what they ought to think. But it still exists. The Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1993 came out with a document in which it said the sort of things which made Leslie Holden, the bloke who I'm quoting from, say, "Jolly, jolly good. Rome has come round to our way of thinking." I think that's gross misrepresentation. Again, I can't put my finger on anything that I regard as wrong in what the Pontifical Biblical Commission said. My problem is that it doesn't say some of the things that I ought to say. So, what is the positive thing that I have ventured to promise you at the end of all this? The positive thing is a way of looking at the Scriptures which goes back to the Fathers. No, I've made a mistake there. It goes back behind the Fathers to the New Testament itself. And I want to get into it as painlessly as possible by talking about, Noah. The story of Noah. Noah and his flood. Noah, his flood, his wife, his ark, and his children, and his animals. There was a time when little boys had wooden models of Noah's ark with wooden models of all the animals in their pairs going in 2 by 2. The Christians who knew Jesus, the disciples, I'm going to be quoting from St. Peter in a moment. The disciples, the early Christians, and the early Christian centuries in general, approached this by using the word type. I'm sorry, there has to be some jargon. All subjects have their technical jargon, don't they? And I do apologize. Can't be avoided. Type, and the other jargon word here is antitype. T-Y-P-E, and antitype. Now, what do we make of the story of Noah? The little boy with the wooden ark, it's a story. Doesn't mean anything. For the Jew, it comes into covenantal theology. What did the early Christians make of it? I don't think you'd guess if you didn't already know, and if I didn't tell you. They thought it was all about baptism. It goes like this. What is the essence of the story of Noah and his ark? The essence of it is, let's summarize it with, salvation through water. There was a flood which washed away sin. The flood happened because God, we are told in the narrative, was angered at the sinfulness of the whole world. Only Noah and his familia were exempt from this. The flood washed away sin. Noah and his family came through the waters of the flood safe. God saved them through water. And for the Christian, that perfectly describes baptism. Through our baptism, through the waters of the font, we became members, limbs, parts of the body of Christ, members of his church, members of the body of Christ, which is him. To say we became members of the church and to say we became members of Christ is to say exactly the same thing, because the church is the body of Christ. Our original sin, which we were born with, was washed away in baptism, and through those waters of baptism we achieved, God gave us, the status of being saved. I'm hopeless at these things without having notes. The reference is 1 Peter 3:20, which I will now find on this incredibly impressive Bible. Christ also died once for our sins, the just for the unjust, that he might offer us to God, being put to death indeed in the flesh, but enlivened in the Spirit, in which also coming he preached to those spirits that were in prison, which had sometime been incredulous, when they waited for the patience of God in the days of Noah, when the ark was a building, wherein a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. Whereunto baptism, being the like form, now saveth you also, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the examination of a good conscience towards God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In the Greek, the word there is type, and then the other word is antitype, because what we say is that the story of Noah, salvation through water, were saved by water. In the Vulgate translation, salve facte sunt per aquam, salvation through water is the essence. Noah and his ark, that was the type. And we being baptized in water is the antitype. You see, that is the way that the technical language, the technical terminology here works. In the Old Testament, there is a type, and then in the New Testament there is the antitype. The type in the Old Testament is something which is assumed to be authoritative, but the antitype in the New Testament supplants it, puts it out of date, makes it old-fashioned. So there is a certain supersessionism, as some people would say, in this type and antitype game. When we come across the antitype in the New Testament, that is seen as, as it were, suppressing the type in the Old Testament. A point that St. Thomas Aquinas makes in that hymn that we very often sing at benediction. He talks about the Eucharist as supplanting its type. Type, the English translation, sung in Anglican Catholic Church as a benediction, is types and shadows have their ending. Types and... He means, quite simply, St. Thomas means, it's quite obvious, isn't it, to anybody, that the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Lord's body and blood, as we have it in our churches today, is the truth and the reality. The Jewish sacrifices of the Old Testament, in which animals and vegetables were sacrificed in the temple at Jerusalem, that is the type. And St. Thomas says that the antitype, the Eucharist, has rendered all those Jewish sacrifices, as described in Exodus and Leviticus and so on, superseded, no longer any good, not any more intended to be used. They're useful, they may have been useful, but who would go for the reality? Who would go for something shadowy if they had the reality? Would you rather go for the shadow of something if you had the thing that was actually making the shadow? Would you go, if you were keen on money, would you go for a photograph of $500,000 rather than the reality of $500,000? People, surely, it's only logic, will go for reality rather than types and shadows. Blessed John Henry Newman made his motto the point that the truth puts to flight the shadows. When the sun rises, it puts to flight the shadows. We are Christians. The antitype puts to flight the type. In other words, we're not concerned with Noah, except that he is a type that points to the antitype, the reality, which is our baptismal incorporation through the waters of baptism into Christ himself, so that we then live his risen, ascended, glorified life, so that we then have in every ounce of our being that sense that we are, because we are in him, we are the risen Christ, because we are limb of his body, member of his body. That is reality. How could anybody want a wooden ark with wooden giraffes if they were offered the sort of reality which Christianity offers us?